Hello again, welcome to another episode of Geopolitika. So today we're going to be talking about some interesting developments in the Middle East. And so the subject today is peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia and the connection with the Brics nations. So what's been happening, it's something that hasn't really been covered by a lot of the established mainstream media. That over the last couple of weeks, we've had a very interesting peace negotiations concluded between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And this was done with the assistance, the intervention, the brokering of China. Now, why is this so interesting? Because sadly and tragically, the Middle East has been split down the middle between so-called warring factions, between the Sunnis and the Shiites, most of all, and a couple of other complicated issues. And this has led to a division which has also spilled over to military interventions, terrorism, and so on and so forth. And therefore, you had both Saudi Arabia and Iran trying to jockey for position within the Middle East to be the most influential countries. But now, after many years, certainly after 8 years since they had broken off diplomatic relations, they have come together and resumed these diplomatic relations. This deal was brokered by China, as I said. That is also pretty interesting because it's not just that they have come together and started to work out their differences. It's also because both are interested in moving towards a new power bloc, a socio-political economic power bloc, which is made up of two organizations, one of them being the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is both an economic and a security bloc, which is made up of China, India, Iran, Kazakhstan, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, and now also Saudi Arabia. And on the other hand, there are the Brics nations, which are a formation of countries being Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And the importance of these two organizations is that there is a shift of power taking place between the traditional Western influenced, controlled organizations that have entrenched the so-called Western hegemony that has been dictating policy, economic policies, financial policies to the rest of the world. But a large chunk of the rest of the world has been moving towards a bit more autonomy, as it were. And these two organizations are part of this. So why is this important? Because since both Saudi Arabia and Iran were interested in moving closer towards both the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Brics nations to be admitted into the Brics nations, China came back and said, well, you need to sort out your differences. And that would clear the path towards integration in the Brics nations. So this is really reading in between the lines, which is not necessarily something you would get so readily in a lot of the Western media. Today we have Jason here with us commenting and giving some interesting feedback. So I would ask you a specific question. How do you see the importance of the so-called developing world moving towards a bit more autonomy? And how would you see the reaction of the Western hegemony and how it would react to this movement?
So I think what's important is that we maybe take a step back and provide some context to the situation. Saudi Arabia, as obviously everyone is aware, has considerable oil reserves, and this has in the past created a situation where there was an agreement between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, in that the U.S. agreed that it would provide Saudi Arabia with U.S. military support in the region, in the Middle East, if the Saudis would agree to accept U.S. dollars as the currency when trading oil. And so this forced countries across the world, who are all dependent upon oil for their economies, to trade in U.S. dollars in order to receive the oil from Saudi Arabia. And this obviously created a tremendous benefit for the U.S. because it strengthened their dollars, since everyone was requiring their dollars in order to trade for oil.
Maybe one could also add that this happened at the time when Nixon had taken the dollar off the gold standard.
That's right.
And that caused a scare because, of course, when it was pegged to gold, then it was accepted universally globally as the world's the global reserve currency. But when it was taken off the gold, then people were getting cold feet. Other countries were saying, well, why should we continue to trade only in dollars when you are printing dollars like there's no tomorrow?
That's right.
And then you expect us to do all the global trading in dollars. So that's where Saudi Arabia came in, that they actually managed to get Saudi Arabia as a key ally to keep trading its oil in dollars. And in exchange, the Saudis would commit to use the dollars they are taking for the oil to buy American bonds.
That's right.
So it would help to prop up the American economy. So they were actually propping up each other's economies. But in a way, that was very beneficial to the dollar system.
And for those who maybe would like a little bit more context, we would recommend that you go back to our previous episode, which is episode 13, on cash banks and digital currencies, and get a little bit more context in that regard. And so now this is a very
interesting time.
Because it seems as though these countries now are moving away from this U.S. dollar hegemony, what we previously referred to as a petrodollar, and now seem to be creating alliances and shifting towards from one source of one currency into now trades with other, as you said, Brics nations, who are also developing their own forms of currencies.
Yes, because if in the past few years the dollar was being, you could say, artificially propped up by the fact that it was being used as a currency for all the world. It's used as a currency in the United States, of course, if you're buying and selling goods and whatnot, being paid your salary. But then outside of the United States, you wouldn't use dollars. You would use your own national currency, or in the case of Europe, the Eurozone, the euro. But then when it came to transacting international trade, you would do that by using dollars. You would trade in dollars. So automatically, the whole world had two currencies. It had the dollar as a currency to trade internationally, and its national currency in order to transact national transactions. So that meant that it was propping up the US dollar in that sense, because it's a question of supply and demand. If you need dollars because you need them in order to transact international trade, then that props up the value of the dollar.
That's right.
Now, if you no longer need the dollar to transact international trade, then it's going to weaken the dollar.
And so one can quickly realize that if the dollar is no longer being supported because it's no longer required for international trade, the value of the US dollar potentially could quickly dwindle, and the US would be, well, it would be quite a situation, I would imagine.
Well, I mean, it doesn't really take an economic expert to know that when you reach a tipping point or a spiral effect, it spirals downwards, things move very quickly. So if countries are not going to transact in dollars, for example, Russia had made it quite clear that it's no longer going to transact. It's got international sanctions or certain country sanctions, not necessarily international. Certain large countries are carrying out sanctions against Russia. And they said, okay, well, if you want to trade with us and buy our oil and gas, then you need to transact in rubles, which would then prop up the ruble. So it's also transacting in the end with the yuan, the Chinese yuan, with China when they're selling oil and gas to China. So automatically there is a movement away from one currency, the US dollar, as a global reserve currency, which is begging the question, is it just a matter of time for the dollar to weaken further? Because if a country is paying for its deficits by issuing new bonds, people have to buy those bonds. If people don't buy those bonds, then how is it going to pay for its deficits?
That's right.
So if Saudi Arabia is buying US bonds with the dollars it has, then it's helping the US economy. If Saudi Arabia, for example, no longer transacts and sells its oil in dollars, then it's going to have fewer dollars to use. But also, it could choose not to buy US bonds. So it's a chain reaction, and I think that essentially you might think that these are not all connected, but as you said, we had just in the previous episode spoken about the strength of currencies, digital currencies. Could there be run on banks? Could there be a problem of banks starting to collapse? And they all work hand in glove. Because if you've got the Brics nations moving away from the Western hegemony, it's going to have a major ripple effect on transactions and trade in the West.
Yes, and now we seem to be hearing the increased war drums of war against China with the U.S., which is, I think, an interesting development given the situation with Saudi Arabia and Iran brokered through China.
Well, I've spoken about this in previous episodes. I think that the main power struggle that has been going on in the last few years has been between the Western hegemony and the Brics nations. So when you see that there are issues turning up in Brazil, is it just because it's Brazil or because Brazil is part of Brics nations? It's like being on using a chessboard and knocking off a few pieces. You don't go for the queen. You don't immediately go for the jugular because you might not be in a position to do that. So if you're moving against Russia, is it because it's part of the Brics nations with their separate policy? And now you mentioned moving against China. So I think really this is why the Brics nations tend to have a pretty loose alliance, which is, it's not a military alliance, it's an economic
alliance
deal. But as we mentioned earlier, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for example, is dealing with both economic and security issues. So you could say to a large extent, the Brics nations are looking, are thinking forward on the same levels. You're not going to get a Brics nation that's going to come out publicly internationally, diplomatically, against another fellow Brics nation, because they know that it's the whole Brics bloc which is being eroded. So diplomatically, they're very careful not to come out against one of the others.
And this Brics, this notion of this term Brics, this is not something which has just come up in the last year or two. In the 2008 crisis, banking crisis, the idea of Brics nations coming together, which were resource-rich countries, that started in basically 2008 with the banking crisis.
Well, yes, essentially, when you have major banks going down, I mean, let's face it, it started in the States, but Europe was shocked by what was happening, because obviously they knew that it would have a ripple effect, not just in Europe, but on the global economy in general. And I suppose we could call a spade a spade. There's been a lot of abuse in the financial systems, a lot of debts that can never really be repaid, because let's face it, the whole debt scenario is something which is a bit fictitious, because if anyone thinks that the global debt is ever going to be repaid,
it's impossible.
It's absolutely impossible. So, but that means that we are living on two different levels, because if you and I were to be in a situation where we can't repay our debts, then banks would foreclose, we'd go under.
That's right.
They'd sell our property, we'd be out on the streets because we would have to declare bankruptcy, we'd have to get protection. But this is not happening on the higher levels, on the macro global level. It's only happening on the micro level for the individual company, the individual person. So really, all these global debts from country to country, they're never going to be paid.
No.
Which means what? which means the economic situation today
Is untenable.
is untenable. And what's going to happen? And you try to prop it up like you would with a ship that's sinking.
By continuing to print money and
Continue to print.
zeros on it.
Pumping money through quantitative easing. Using digital currencies to prevent runs on banks. Controlling people's money, possibly taking people's money. Then of course there's inflation setting in, so inflation would erode your money further.
Absolutely.
And so there are all these little bits and bobs that I think in the West there's a major attempt to keep the current economic situation afloat. And the developing nations are moving away from the Western hegemony to say, listen, the system is going to sink and we don't want to be sinking with it. We want to be setting up our own system, and we want to be as secure as possible. And I think this is where the global conflict is. The global conflict is not about a bit military intervention here or there, or what happened in Iraq or in Syria or in Ukraine. No. They're all pieces of
a puzzle.
Well, yeah, pieces on a chessboard.
Absolutely.
They're all pieces on a chessboard.
D'accord.
In fact, speaking of Syria, it's interesting that Saudi Arabia is also looking to make peace with Syria. So again, probably a few whispers in their ear from the Chinese. Listen, it's not enough to sort it out with Iran. You need to sort out your this whole mess in the Middle East, and you need to come together because for all their faults. The Chinese were always knocking them for a number of things, and there's no need to go into all the details, but they're a communist regime, and
human rights violations.
No, human rights violations. They might not compete on a fair basis when it comes to the business scenario. With
climate,
climate, and opening up a couple of
coal mines and so forth.
Coal-powered stations to a week, I believe they're building. So we're talking about all this climate change, but then they're going back to coal-powered stations. So there are a lot of issues. But then the counter side, to be the devil's advocate, is that it seems that on a diplomatic level, the Chinese have been one step ahead of the West, because the West has been talking military a lot. It's been flexing a lot of military muscle. Whereas the Chinese are talking about, listen, we need to expand economic ties and trades, but we need to have stability, we need to have peace. So they're working on both. They're not using strong arm tactics in that sense. They have other strong arm tactics, but they're not taking the military
tact.
The cowboy shooting from the hip policy. It could happen because, of course, there's a lot of tension in Asia. But so far, the attack has been: listen, let's do business. They also do business because maybe their human rights policy is not exactly a very good one. Then they don't care about the human rights policy of Saudi Arabia. So as far as they're concerned, let's do business anyway. So of course these are very important issues that we tend to hold dear in the West, human rights issues. But the point is, if you allow military conflicts to get in the way, or you sever relations with a country because of your own economic interests, rather than seeing how you could join those economic interests, then I think we're going to end up losing the economic struggle with the Brics nations.
And people need to keep in mind that the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Israel have been very diplomatically intertwined over the decades, even with the origination of the Saudi kingdom, and so it's quite dramatic, the shift, the paradigm shift that we've seen in the last few weeks with this agreement, because obviously, China, Iran being stated enemies of the U.S., Iran now for decades, and China just recently, and so I think it's quite significant the developments that we've seen over the last couple of weeks.
I think it's a question of many countries looking at a sinking ship which is the Western way of setting up the global economy and the push and the agenda of the globalists, and wanting to move away from that sinking ship. It's not really a question of which is more important, because I think the Saudis realize that when push comes to shove, if they're going to make their differences with Iran the central point of their policy, and they're sticking to a ship which is sinking, then it's not going to make sense to them. So I think this is what's happening, regardless of the human rights records of certain countries and whether they should do this, that, and the other. But for economic expediency, they're moving away from sinking ships.
And an interesting side
when
note,
they're seeing the banking system very, very fragile, let's put it this way. And of course, that banking system has been largely dominated by Western powers and Western interests. I think they're moving away from those sinking ships.
And an interesting side note, just a few months ago, when the conflict with Russia and Ukraine was really ramping up, Biden had went to Saudi Arabia requesting that they open the spigot for more oil because of sanctions, and Saudi,
and in fact, they did the opposite.
Told him to go pound sand, and I think that was
the opposite. Yes,
canary in the coal mine there.
Yes. Instead of increasing production, no, this was just after the conflict broke out not broke out.
When sanctions were placed.
The conflict increased, shall we say, in Ukraine. Instead, they cut down on production. So, it's very interesting. It's amazing how, unfortunately, a lot of the mainstream media has not even covered it.
That.
And yet it is so unbelievably
important.
You can't understand what's happening today if you don't follow these issues. Yes. But I can see why they are not covering such issues, because they're very embarrassing. It's like when you lose a chess piece on the board. You're not sort of boasting about it, are you? And this is what happens when you're at war. If a battle doesn't go your way, you're not telling your people you've lost the battle. You just say as little as possible. Then, of course, if the battle goes your way, then you splash it over all the news, how that latest battle in the war has gone your way. So really, this is really what's happening. The media, unfortunately, is very largely compromised, very largely captured, controlled by the globalists.
Yes, absolutely.
And those globalists now have the Brics nations to contend with, because
unfortunately, I think their narrative has become so complicated that I don't think they can spin it in such a way that the people remain blind to it. I think people are waking up to what's really going on around them, and I think that these type of issues now are coming to the fore. Even when we have independent news media like we have with PM News and so forth, I think these things are really coming to the fore rather quickly, and people are waking up.
Well, I mean, to what extent can you spin something? Because if economies start to collapse, it's no point trying to blame someone else. Your citizens are going to say, listen, the economy has collapsed. You say, oh, but it's this or that country or this. It's like...
Plus you have incongruencies in the narrative, and nothing's making sense.
Yeah, so I think we're reaching a stage where our economies are going to be very, very heavily transformed. And it's no wonder that there was so much rhetoric in the last 2-3 years about building back better and the new normal, and all these catchy phrases. Because it's always been about the economy.
Always, and it always will be.
Been about it. I mean, historically, it's always been. It's never been about anything else. So I think there's going to be a massive shift in power, not specifically military or political, but certainly economic. Power is shifting very, very quickly. Movements under our feet. So I guess we'll have to wait to see what happens
transpires.
The next few months. So thank you very much to all of you who have watched our latest episode, and we look forward to seeing you again on our next one. Have a good day.